Tonight, we step into the dusty, whisker-soaked world of the Wild West Saloon. Not the romanticized version with clean glasses and heroic cowboys. No, this is the real saloon, where the food was questionable, the hygiene was worse, and the only thing keeping you alive was the hope that the beans wouldn't kill you before the outlaw did. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to eat in a frontier saloon? What was that mysterious meat pie made of? Why did cowboys soak their crackers in whiskey? And how did a plate of beans become the unsung hero of the American West? Tonight, we'll pull up a stool, order whatever's in the pot, and discover the gritty, greasy, surprisingly fascinating truth about saloon food. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into history's strangest meals, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, perhaps a blanket, and let us begin. You've been riding for hours. The sun has baked your hat, the dust has coated your throat, and your stomach is growling like a wounded bear. You push through the swinging doors of the first saloon you see. The smell hits you first, a mix of whiskey, sweat, and something frying that you hope is beef. You're hungry. You're desperate. You order whatever they have. This is your first mistake. The menu, if you can call it that, is simple. Beans, hardtack, salted pork, and if you're lucky, a meat pie of mysterious origin. But let's start with the beans. They were the unsung heroes of the frontier diet. Cheap, filling, and capable of surviving an apocalypse, a gunfight, and a stampede without breaking a sweat. Pinto, black, navy, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, it ended up in the pot. In a saloon kitchen, those beans had often been sitting in a black pot for days, reheated and reheated until they achieved a texture somewhere between porridge and mud. Sometimes the cook added a chunk of salt pork for flavor. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, you ate them because the alternative was nothing. There is a strange intimacy in sharing a plate of beans with a stranger, both of you pretending not to notice the gritty texture or the faint aftertaste of something you couldn't identify. Your tin spoon scrapes the bowl, and for a moment, your eyes meet across the splintered table. He shrugs. You shrug. The beans are terrible, but they are hot, and in a world where most meals are cold and eaten from a still bag, hot is a luxury. Of course, there was the aftermath. One cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans was a biological weapon. It's said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, but by a single silent but deadly betrayal near the stove. Still, you keep eating. The beans are dependable. When the meat runs out, when the chickens flee, and when the cook has exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remain, unbothered, unburnt, unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and used as makeshift currency in emergencies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise never to return. So you scrape the last of the gravy with a crust of hardtack, raise your tin cup to the cook, and ask for another shot. But the beans are only the beginning. Next comes the real test of your frontier stomach. Hardtack and salt pork, the indestructible duo that has broken more teeth than a barroom brawl. And that, dear listener, is where our story turns. So you scrape the last of the gravy with a crust of hardtack, raise your tin cup to the cook, and ask for another shot. But the beans are only the beginning. Next comes the real test of your frontier stomach. Hardtack and salt pork, the indestructible duo that has broken more teeth than a barroom brawl. Hardtack was not bread. This was a cracker so dense and dry that it could survive a river crossing, a still bag, and a winter in the Rockies without changing texture. Made from flour, water, and salt, it was designed to last forever, which was good, because it tasted like it already had. The first bite was a commitment. You didn't chew hardtack so much as you grappled with it. Some cowboys swore by soaking it in coffee, letting the hot liquid penetrate the rock-like slab until it softened into something resembling edible cardboard. Others preferred whiskey, reasoning that if the hardtack was going to fight back, they might as well be drunk. A few brave souls ate it dry, a decision they usually regretted around the time their fillings surrendered. Salt pork was no gentler. It came in barrels, swimming in brine so salty it could season a small ocean. The meat was fatty, tough, and often streaked with a greenish tinge that you learned not to examine too closely. When fried, it sizzled and popped, filling the saloon with a smell that was either heavenly or nauseating, depending on how long you'd been riding. When eaten cold, and it often was, it had the texture of a salted leather belt and the flavor of regret. But salt pork had its fans. It was easy to transport, hard to ruin, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. Cooks didn't waste a single bit. The fat was used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits. The rind was tossed into stews or given to dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud." And yes, sometimes the pork was suspicious. A questionable smell here. A slimy texture there. But in a saloon, the motto wasn't "Is it fresh?" It was more like, "Did it kill the last guy?" If not, you gave it a try. You sliced off a chunk, dipped it in your bean broth, and swallowed without breathing. The salt burned your throat. The fat coated your tongue. And for a moment, you felt almost full. But the true challenge of frontier dining wasn't the beans or the pork. It was the stew, the bubbling, brown, unidentifiable stew that every saloon claimed was today's special. And that, dear listener, is where the real mystery begins. But the true challenge of frontier dining wasn't the beans or the pork. It was the stew, the bubbling, brown, unidentifiable stew that every saloon claimed was today's special. And that, dear listener, is where the real mystery begins. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer. Hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, or couldn't legally describe. The base was simple: a pot, a fire, and ambition. You started with water, maybe some beans or potatoes, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet. Beef, sure. Rabbit, definitely. Squirrel, yep. Rattlesnake. If it wasn't biting anymore, toss it in. One traveler once claimed he found a bootstring in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Some stews had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher. Others had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the cook looked nervous and the dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges. Onions disappeared completely. Potatoes held on the longest, but eventually surrendered. The result was a bubbling brown-grey slurry that smelled way better than it looked and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt and a generous helping of hope. Spices were a luxury. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a fancy place. If you got chili powder, congratulations. Your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. There was a strange ritual to eating stew. You'd dip your spoon in, lift it slowly, and squint at whatever clung to the tin. Was that a piece of potato? A chunk of gristle? The remains of a button? You'd sniff it, hesitate, then close your eyes and swallow. The other cowboys watched, waiting to see if you'd survive. If you did, they'd nod and dig in themselves. If you turned green, they'd quietly push their bowls away and order whiskey. The cook, standing by the pot with his arms crossed, would scowl. "Ain't nothing wrong with that stew," he'd mutter. "You boys just got soft stomachs." And maybe he was right. Or maybe the stew had been sitting since Tuesday, reheated so many times it had developed a personality and a low opinion of you. Still, you ate it. Because when the choice is between stew and nothing, stew always wins. But no matter how bad the food was, there was always one thing on the menu that never let you down: whiskey. And that, dear listener, is where our final course begins. But no matter how bad the food was, there was always one thing on the menu that never let you down: whiskey. And that, dear listener, is where our final course begins. In the Wild West, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was a survival tool, a social lubricant, and sometimes the only thing keeping you upright after a bowl of questionable stew. Water was often contaminated. Coffee required a fire. But whiskey was always available, cheap, strong, and alcoholic enough to kill the bacteria that would otherwise kill you. The typical saloon whiskey wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by connoisseurs. It was raw, harsh, and sometimes cut with additives like turpentine, gunpowder, or cayenne pepper to give it a kick. One bartender was said to have used a dash of kerosene when he ran out of whiskey. The customers didn't complain. They were too busy trying to see straight. There was a ritual to ordering it. You'd walk up to the bar, slap down a few coins, and the barkeep would pour a shot into a cloudy tin cup. No ice. No fancy glass. Just amber liquid that caught the lamplight like a warning. You'd sniff it first, always a gamble, then toss it back in one gulp. The burn was immediate, traveling down your throat like a freight train, settling in your chest like a campfire. If you coughed, the other cowboys laughed. If you didn't, they nodded in respect. Some men drank it to forget the blisters, the loneliness, the loved ones they'd left behind. Others drank it to summon courage before a gunfight or to numb the pain after one. And a few drank it simply because it was there, and because the alternative was facing another plate of being sober. Whiskey was also currency. You could pay for a meal, a bed, or a favor with a bottle. It was offered as a toast to the dead, as a bribe to the sheriff, and as a peace offering after a barroom brawl. There was a strange intimacy in sharing a drink with a stranger. Two men who might be enemies by sunrise, but for now, they clinked their cups and swallowed together. The whiskey warmed their bellies and loosened their tongues. Secrets were traded over shots. Promises were made and broken. And sometimes, when the bottle was empty and the night was late, a cowboy would lean close and whisper something he'd never say sober. The bartender, wiping the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War, would pretend not to listen. But he heard everything. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the dusty street and the cowboys stumbled out, the only evidence of the night before was a row of empty cups and the faint smell of regret. The whiskey was gone, but the memories, or the lack of them, lingered. And if the food made you sick, at least the whiskey made you forget. In the Wild West, that was as close to a cure as you could get. But the saloon was only one chapter of the frontier story. Beyond its swinging doors lay the open plains, the mountains, and the graves of those who didn't make it. And that, dear listener, is where we turn next, to the trail itself and the people who walked it.